Alright, so now we've had a bit of a look at defining individual species based on a range of features. We also need to understand that species might be categorized by some other mechanisms that actually occur. So it's not just things like whether they can interbreed, which we will talk about, but there are other things that allow species to be individual from each other. And this concept of reproductive isolation allows us to then further explore then why species actually don't become more merged together and we can actually see them distinctly from each other. So really important that you are able to A, talk about reproductive isolation confidently, B, look at mechanisms of pre-zygotic mechanisms, so why they actually exist and what that actually means, and then C, look at post-zygotic mechanisms for why we can't actually potentially have species interbreeding. So firstly, we look at reproductive isolation, and so what this is basically this says that there are other mechanisms that allow for us to think about why species cannot be categorized together. And they can be defined as something that happens before the sperm and egg cell comes together or after sperm and egg cell comes together. And when we talk about those, we say that this is a pre-zygotic isolation. So that's something before sperm and egg cell come together. So something before technically sex. And then post-zygotic, something after sperm and egg can come together and potentially fuse to make a zygote. And that's after sex. So these kinds of mechanisms are pre and post sex, if in that sort of casual way that we use that language, but we say that this is reproductive isolation and it's subcategorized in these two ways. So pre-zygotic mechanisms. So these are things that are generally more associated with geographic location and things like behaviors. So we look at things like time isolation. So maybe that organisms might not exist on the same actual cycles, so when they're fertile. And so if that actually occurs, we might say that an owl, which is a nocturnal organism, might not actually want to breed with, say, a seagull, because they're not actually active at the same times. So those sort of time isolation mechanisms will allow for those species to remain distinctly different from each other. We can also look at different types of behaviors that organisms might exist, so like courtship or dancing and stuff like that, and that they just don't attract certain other populations. So you can see that some organisms that do these, big displays or that have big plumages, so we look at peacocks that have big plumages, that's a behavioral thing that they have, but that doesn't attract all types of birds. So really it's about what are you doing, the behavior that you're exhibiting, and will that attract a mate? And if it doesn't, then that's going to maintain that distinction between species. So these are two pre-zygotic mechanisms, so things that basically, in essence, when it comes down to it, but don't use this language in an examinable question, why organisms will not have sex. Then we look at actually, well, if that was to occur, if two organisms were to come together and they were to interbreed or have sex, we look at, oh no, I've still got more. Yep. No, so we've got further pre-zygotic mechanisms, actually, that I'll talk about now. So there might be that there are basically some different structural features that exist. So again, why two organisms cannot come together? They're just not compatible. So A does not fit into B, and so that just doesn't work. And so if we've got that sort of scenario, there's absolutely no way. So that sort of underpinning idea of the genetics of the organism will influence what the organism looks like. And if the organism's, reproductive parts are different to the others, then they're not going to fit in each other. So mechanisms or morphological isolation is the anatomical structural differences. And then we look at basically that we might have differences in the gamete isolation. So the types of gametes, or the sperm and egg cells, are actually different from each other. And so they can't fuse together to create a zygote. So let's say, for example, the organisms can come together and they can actually interbreed. We might say that there's no fusion of the sperm and egg cell because they are chemically different from each other. And so because of that, we can still categorize that as a pre-zygotic mechanism. I know I talked about this idea of sex, but really pre-zygotic means the fusing of sperm and egg, or the creation of a zygote. And so if that can't happen because they are distinctly different from each other, then we're not going to get anything actually actually forming as a result of, even if there is interbreeding happening.